Hello. There's an old proverb which says to live your life is not so easy as to cross a field. In parallel, to learn to paint watercolour landscape is not so easy as just learning technique. What I mean by that is that we all, when we start off, long to have a technique to support the glorious things we see in the countryside when we want to put them down on paper. And the whole aspect of what we're on today is both watercolour technique and the love of landscape painting. As far as I'm concerned, you can't separate the two, and I wouldn't want to. I've always been in love with the landscape, and I've always been in love with watercolour painting, so the two together create a happy mixture of enjoyment for me and a challenge at the same time. And there's no reason at all why it shouldn't be the same for you. You can probably see that if I love the outside, there's plenty of atmospheric shots to enjoy during this video, and this gives the impression that I spend a lot of time actually painting outside. Now, I'm actually a studio painter, and that doesn't mean to say that I'm not in the countryside. I spend a lot of time out there observing, and painting is all about observation. So what I want to put over is that whether you subscribe to the English tradition, that is sitting in front of a scene and painting it, or whether you subscribe to the, as I do, the Oriental idea, that is if you see a scene, go home and paint it, it doesn't really matter. If it works for you, then it's great. As far as I'm concerned, the latter one works for me. I prefer to go home with the essence of it in my mind and to put that down on watercolour paper. So it does mean actually training your visual memory, and that is something that can only come with practice. There is no substitute for practice. Anyway, do enjoy this video, do enjoy the concept of the watercolour wash, and do believe that though it seems difficult, practice will make it come. So do enjoy and do appreciate that practice is all important, that you can find enjoyment and not gritting your teeth and saying I can't do it. You can find the enjoyment if you persevere, and above all you're in love with that landscape, which is what it's all about. Our first demonstration is going to involve a total wet in wet painting. When I say total wet in wet, as far as it is able to be total, there are just certain small elements at the end which will have to involve a small amount, say, of gouache or a small amount of wash, but as far as we're concerned, most of the painting, 90% of the painting, hopefully will be done on a wet surface. So obviously the first thing we're going to do is to spray the surface. I use a spray bottle to do this, because it's best to touch the surface of the paper as little as possible with the brush. It's quite a delicate surface, even though it's 100% rag paper. And then just spread that out with the brush, rather than actually ladling it on with the brush. And it's a matter of getting that surface totally wet. It's a matter of making sure that every inch of the paper, right up to the edges, is actually damp. In fact, more than damp, pretty wet, because I want it to soak in, and that is going to provide us with the basis for the painting for the next quite a few minutes. And this is an all-important stage, even though it looks simple. You certainly can't bypass it, and certainly wouldn't want to. So, having got the paper wet, and it's a matter of holding it against the light, looking against the light to make sure that every inch of it is covered, it's then a question of letting it soak in, and that also takes a few minutes to get it to the right situation where painting can start. So while I'm waiting for that, I'll be explaining a bit about the materials I use, the equipment I use, in order to achieve some of these effects. I think that's wet enough now, so we'll explain a little bit about the paint and the brushes and the paper. The materials I use are as follows. The watercolour paper is Lana, spelled L-A-N-A. It's a French 100% rag paper, and it's 300 pounds in weight. The surface is rough, though actually the rough in Lana is very equivalent to the knot in Arche. The only difference is that the surface might be the same, but the quality of the paper as well might be the same, but the whole concept of the paper is its softness. And the great thing about Lana is that it's very absorbent and is ideal for wet in wet. The paints I use are artist quality, and I buy them in 14 milliliter tubes. So I have French ultramarine, light red, raw sienna, alizarin crimson, Windsor blue, and Windsor yellow. Also I have Payne's grey. For my purposes I prefer the Roni Payne's grey to the Winsor & Newton, because the darks, which I mix up with light red, are better for banks and not so green as the Winsor & Newton. I also use gouache just for foregrounds in a very limited way, and these are as follows: permanent white, olive green, scarlet lake, spectrum yellow, and sky blue. These are purely optional and purely according to your taste. I also use an oil painter's paper palette, which I find useful because you can tear it off and throw it away after you've finished a painting, instead of having to clear off all those hard little bits of paint, and this is often quite tedious. The brushes I use are as follows. That's a Hake brush, though an English equivalent of the Chinese brush, which it is. Also other Chinese brushes. That's a proper Chinese brush. Not expensive, even though it's a big brush, £8 or £9 at the most. A medium-sized Chinese brush, and two riggers, a large one and a size 0. I also use a shaving brush and a toothbrush. Toothbrush is for splattering, and I have many other brushes as well. We might as well also briefly touch on the subject of composition. My understanding of composition is basically keeping the eye within the picture. We have to do this in an interesting way so that the eye does not either leave the picture or get bored in looking at the picture. We normally would have some sort of focal point which we would understand not to be right in the centre of the picture or halfway down the picture, that we've obviously read about many times. I obviously focus on foreground foliage a lot, as you've seen, and I find this an interesting point because it helps the eye to actually pause for a second before going into the rest of the picture. Just gives added interest. That is purely optional according to how you're feeling at the time. Some pictures might not require foreground foliage. I think the paper is in a situation where it's more or less able to be started. It's always a matter of judging it according to the light shining on it. So I'm going to first of all mix some raw sienna, because you will see from the few small guidelines I've done, this is going to be a river scene, and it's going to be into the sun, which is my favourite mode of painting. So we're going to have to leave the sun as white light, obviously white light, and paint round it. So this will seem strange at first, but I will start off with a circular movement of the brush in raw sienna. When people see this, they usually make a sharp intake of breath, because they wonder what on earth I'm doing. but all will be revealed as we proceed. So we're building up this raw sienna circle round the sun. Basically the sun itself is white light, but the yellow warm effect, the sun's rays will radiate out from that central source of power. From that we'll mix a little alizarin crimson, be still further warmth. This is purely background, you must realise this, and while it may seem strange at this stage, hopefully it will begin to take shape as we go along. So as you can see, I'm using a large brush, a large Chinese brush with a circular movement, and moving outwards from that light source. And obviously as we get further from it, we will get bluer and cooler. So I'm mixing some ultramarine into the alizarin crimson now. Who said skies shouldn't be colourful? And in a sense they dictate what the picture is all about. And I like to see some of the colour in the sky that is actually in the rest of the landscape. As I said earlier, this is all about a personal response to painting, and this is my response to it. I'm always so devastated when I look into the sun and see that amazing source of light for which we couldn't exist, without which we couldn't exist, and to actually see the way it characterises all that's around it. And I think you'll agree with me that there is nothing more impressive than those late afternoon scenes when the sun's lower in the sky and is actually permeating the whole of the scene with its golden light. So there we have the basis of a sky. I'm actually going to mix some French Ultra with some light red. And radiate out from that point perhaps some streaky bits of cloud which you tend to get in the sunsetty skies. The whole idea is to lead the eye in, which it's got to be inevitably anyway, to that source of light. It needs to be a little warmer, so we mix a bit more light red with that French ultramarine. The colour that goes on at first usually dries a lot lighter in watercolour. Consequently, it's important to have a certain amount of strength in the picture, or else it will get named as wishy-washy, as watercolours seem to traditionally be called so often. I think all that's changing now, hopefully, but in the past that did have that stigma, and it is important to avoid that and to ensure that the colour goes on in a bold way, so that when it finally dries out it's not too light. Now we've got to try and soften perhaps the starkness of this yellow light. We can perhaps drag some of these clouds straight into it, so as not to make it too obvious. As you can see, I'm using my brush in pretty continual motion because I'm adapting and merging these colours all the time, because you're dealing with a sky here, you're not dealing with something that's solid, you're dealing with something that needs to be toned down in one sense because it's an amorphous, vaporous substance, and we can't treat it as though we're painting a building. I've just got some clear water just to lift off a bit of that where it's gone a bit too far. but I still feel that perhaps we should just take on or take off a little bit of the intensity of this yellow. And as I'm doing this, I'm really sort of feeling my way through the painting, and usually find that in the end the effect that I'm looking for is available. Remember that we've got to do an awful lot while this paper is wet, so it's quite a tall order, and we're in a sense racing against the clock to ensure that we get the rest in. Well, that has certainly given us our light source. Now I'm going to mix some Winsor yellow with some raw sienna and some French ultra and start in the banks. So we're going to bring in this mixture which has created a fairly warm green, and as you'll see, I don't actually use a tube green but mix the greens always, because then you can adjust them according to the painting you're doing. The tube greens tend to be rather intense, and the mixed greens somehow seem to have more naturalness in them. Now remember what I said earlier about the fact that when it dries lighter, and this green may appear at this stage to be rather stark, but hopefully in the end, once we've added more colour and it's begun to dry, there will be certainly a more naturalness about it. I'm actually adding a bit of light red into it as well. You'll notice as well that I very rarely dip my brush into the water. It's a big brush for a start, so it holds a lot of water, and it enables you to keep going for quite a long time. I'm mixing light red and French ultra for the dark edge of the bank. I'm actually going to drop a bit of alizarin crimson into this foliage, because I do like to see colour in the grass just as much as I like to see colour in the sky, and there's all sorts of colours. But if you're going to put some sort of red in, you know you've got to balance it up to a certain extent with a bit of blue. It is so easy to put stark colours in without being aware of colour balance. At this stage I'm suddenly noticing this is a bit too blue along the bottom of this bank, so we can always add a bit of light red to remedy that. Now, while we're there, we will perhaps do the reflections in the water. Bear in mind we've got the light source there, so we're going to try and, if possible, keep that by itself, and we're going to repeat to a certain extent what we see in the sky. So we've got the yellow sun's rays there, reflected there, and we're going to leave the light bit for the actual power source of the sun, and we're going to use vertical brush strokes into the water. Remember with water that it's a reflective surface, consequently you're going to get verticals for the reflections. Also it is a surface, and you're going to get horizontals as well. You'll see that my paper has actually dried off here, but that can't be helped, and as I say so often in these type of demonstrations, the great thing is not to worry about it. When we concern ourselves about our paintings, get concerned about what we're doing, get concerned about whether we're getting the right effect. It probably shows in the painting and brings out that tension when we really want the freedom. Painting is all about freedom. Atmosphere is put on with a big brush, and when we paint it, there is no reason not to use the same principle. So you can see that we have got the makings of a landscape here, and this is all done while the surface is wet. It's all about light, it's all about mood, it's all about atmosphere, it's all about feeling. And really, if you're not feeling something for the landscape, then there's no way that you will paint a convincing landscape. You've got to have seen that landscape first. You've got to have gone round that corner and then seen that amazing scene and made perhaps a sharp intake of breath. That at least would prove to you, or prove to yourself, that you have the feeling for the landscape that is so necessary to be able to be turned into paint onto paper. As I said earlier, the techniques are all important, but they're not the only thing. If you've got that feeling for the landscape, that love for it, then that will show in your painting, and it won't be just purely an exercise in technique. I'm feeling that perhaps we need to intensify these banks still further. We have got the light red and the ultramarine still. Later on, if it dries, I might use some Payne's grey mixed with light red. Now, Payne's grey is not a very nice colour. It's a bluey dark grey sort of colour, and the only use I find is that it fans out beautifully in a wet and wet wash, particularly if that wet and wet wash is drying very fast. And then it has its uses. Conversely, it is very difficult if the wash is very wet, because it goes hopelessly out of control. I've got to add a little bit more light red here. And while we're here, I'm going to just use my tissue to preserve this light from the sun, which unfortunately got a bit of paint on there. Because I use my own adage and not worry about it, because there's a way out in most things, even in watercolour, and even in this most difficult and dangerous way of painting. After all, painting a whole scene wet in wet is one of the most dangerous ways of painting the landscape, but also one of the most rewarding. Now, we mustn't forget these other banks here. Remember, the river is winding its way up there, and we've perhaps got to get a little bit lower and more distant as we handle those banks in the distant. Mix a little bit of ultramarine and just formulate the shape of the banks against the ones in front. Now, while we're there, we need to think about some background trees. I will use the blue and the red again, and we will